September 20th, 1944. A small farming village in southern England. No warning sirens, no engine noise overhead. Just silence. And then in an instant, 3 people dead, 17 more injured. A crater where a house used to be. The blast heard for miles. But here's what terrified everyone. No one heard it coming. Not a single soul, because what hit them that morning would tore through the sky at over 3,500 miles per hour wasn't supposed to exist yet. The British government told the public it was a gas main explosion. They lied. What really struck that village came from the edge of space itself, and it marked the beginning of something the world had never seen before. The Germans called it Vergeltungswaffe 2, the Vengeance Weapon 2. We know it as the V-2 rocket, and on that September morning in 1944, humanity crossed a threshold. For the first time in history, a man-made object had left the lower atmosphere, touched the darkness beyond our sky, and then fallen back to Earth as a weapon. This wasn't just another bomb. This was the future arriving decades early, built by prisoners in underground caves, designed by men who dreamed of the stars, and twisted into an instrument of terror by a regime desperate to turn the tide of a war they were losing. But the story of the V-2, the real story, it doesn't start with that first attack. It starts years earlier, with a young man standing in a field outside Berlin, watching a small rocket sputter, spiral, and crash into the dirt. His name was Wernher von Braun. He was 20 years old, and he believed, truly believed, that rockets could take humanity to the moon. What he built instead, well, that's what we're here to talk about. See, most people know the V-2 as Hitler's terror weapon. Fewer know it as the grandfather of every space program that followed. But almost nobody knows the full truth, the messy, complicated, bloody truth about how a dream of space exploration became a nightmare that killed thousands, and then, in one of history's strangest ironies, actually did take us to the stars. Because the same rocket that fell on London in 1944 became the template for the missiles that carried the first satellites into orbit, that put humans on the moon, that still, to this day, launch every space mission from Earth. The V-2's DNA runs through every rocket we've ever built since. So how did it happen? How does a weapon of war become the key to space? And what price, what terrible price, did humanity pay to get there? Let's go back to Germany in the 1920s. The First World War is over. Germany is broken, humiliated, restricted by the Treaty of Versailles from building the weapons they lost them the war. No large military, no heavy artillery, no air force. But here's the thing about restrictions. They make people creative. And there was one weapon the treaty forgot to mention, one technology that barely existed yet: rockets. Enter the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, the Society for Space Travel, a group of dreamers, engineers, and amateur rocketeers who gathered in fields and abandoned lots to launch homemade rockets that usually exploded on the pad or veered wildly off course. They weren't trying to build weapons, they were trying to reach space. They read science fiction, they discussed lunar trajectories over beer, they believed in something that seemed impossible to everyone else. Among them, a young engineering student named Wernher von Braun. Von Braun was brilliant, charismatic, obsessed. At 18, he was already conducting rocket experiments. At 20, he'd impressed the head of the German Army's ballistics department enough to get funding for research. You see, while von Braun dreamed of space, the Army saw something else. They saw a weapon that could fly farther than any artillery shell, faster than any airplane, immune to interception, a weapon that could strike an enemy from hundreds of miles away with no warning, and they were willing to pay for it. By 1932, von Braun was working for the German military. By 1937, he and his team had relocated to a remote island on Germany's Baltic coast, Peenemünde. That name would become legendary. A secret research facility hidden from the world where some of the greatest engineering minds of the era gathered to solve an impossible problem. How do you build a rocket that can carry a ton of explosives, fly 200 miles, and hit a target the size of a city? The challenges were staggering. Every rocket that had been built before was tiny, experimental, unreliable. Von Braun's team needed to scale up by orders of magnitude. They needed an engine powerful enough to lift several tons. They needed to solve combustion problems that could turn the rocket into a fireball in the launch pad. They needed guidance systems that could keep the rocket on course during a flight that would take it to altitudes where the air was too thin for fins to work. They needed to figure out how to protect the rocket from the heat of atmospheric re-entry, problems that wouldn't be fully solved for decades. They needed to solve them now. And somehow, they did. Test after test, failure after failure, rockets that exploded, rockets that disintegrated in mid-air, rockets that flew for 30 seconds before tumbling out of control. But slowly, painfully, they made progress. Each failure taught them something. Each explosion revealed a flaw they could fix, and von Braun pushed them forward with an almost manic energy, because he absolutely knew that if they could make this work, they'd be making history. October 3rd, 1942, Peenemünde, a cold, clear autumn day. A rocket stood on the launch pad, 46 feet tall, gleaming white and black, elegant in a way no weapon had ever been. The A4 they called it. Aggregate 4, the culmination of years of work, millions of Reichsmarks, thousands of engineering hours. This was their fourth major design, and if it actually worked, everything would change. The countdown began. Engineers held their breath. Von Braun watched through binoculars, his hands shaking. At 0, the engine ignited. Flame erupted from the base, a roar that shook the ground. And then the rocket lifted, slowly at first, almost gracefully, rising on a pillar of fire. Faster, faster, climbing through the clouds, accelerating to speeds no aircraft could match. The assembled engineers watched it disappear into the sky, tracked it by telemetry, heard the numbers coming back. 5,000 feet, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 feet, higher than any plane could fly. And then the engine cut off, exactly as planned. The rocket had reached the top of its arc. For a moment, it hung there, at the edge of space, higher than any human-made object had ever been, 53 miles above the Earth, above 99% of the atmosphere, in the darkness where the sky turns black and stars shine, even in daytime. It had touched space. And then, obeying nothing but gravity and ballistics, it began to fall back to Earth. The rocket came down 120 miles away, exactly where the calculations said it would. When the reports came back, when they confirmed the impact point, the engineers at Peenemünde erupted in celebration. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. They'd built a machine that could leave the atmosphere and strike a target 200 miles away with reasonable accuracy. Von Braun reportedly turned to his colleagues and said, "This afternoon, the spaceship was born." But that spaceship was designed to carry death, and the men celebrating that day knew it. Whatever von Braun's dreams of space travel, whatever his vision of rockets carrying humans to other worlds, that wasn't what the A4 was for. Not yet, not during a war. The A4 was a weapon, and it was about to become the V-2. By 1943, Germany was losing the war. The tide had turned at Stalingrad. Allied bombers were pounding German cities. The invasion of Europe was coming. Hitler was desperate for a wonder weapon, a Wunderwaffe that could turn everything around, and he was told about the A4, a rocket that could strike London, couldn't be intercepted, couldn't even be heard approaching, a terror weapon that would break British morale and force them out of the war. Hitler loved it. He ordered it into mass production. The A4 became the V-2, and Peenemünde went from research facility to weapons factory. But there was a problem. Building V-2 rockets wasn't like building regular weapons. Each rocket required precision engineering, exotic materials, intricate assembly. They needed 80,000 components per rocket, each one machined to exact specifications. They needed liquid oxygen, alcohol fuel, specialized gyroscopes, complex electrical systems, and they needed to build thousands of them fast while Allied bombers were targeting their factories. So they moved production underground, deep into the Harz Mountains in central Germany. There was an old mining tunnel system called Kohnstein. The SS turned it into a factory. They called it Mittelbau-Dora, and they filled it with slave labor. This is where the story gets dark, darker than anything we've talked about so far. Because to build von Braun's rockets, the Nazis used concentration camp prisoners. Thousands of them worked to death in conditions so horrific that survivors would later call it one of the worst camps in the entire system. The tunnels were cold, damp, filled with dust from excavation. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, sleeping in the tunnels, never seeing sunlight. Inadequate food, no medical care, guards who beat or killed anyone who slowed down. The rockets were assembled in massive underground halls, cathedral-like spaces carved from solid rock. Prisoners stood on scaffolding around each V-2, installing components, welding sections, testing systems. One mistake could mean execution. The work was precision engineering done by starving, exhausted people working under threat of death. And when the tunnels weren't ready yet, when production was behind schedule, prisoners slept on the bare rock in their own filth, dying by the dozens every day from disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. By the end of the war, more people had died building the V-2 than died from the V-2 attacks. Think about that. The weapon killed about 3,000 people when it was used, but building it killed at least 20,000 prisoners, maybe more. The exact number is unknown because records were destroyed and many victims were never identified. 20,000 people worked to death underground to build a weapon that would ultimately have almost no military impact. The V-2 changed warfare, changed technology, changed history, but at a cost measured in human lives that's almost impossible to comprehend. And von Braun? He visited Mittelbau-Dora. He saw the conditions. He knew where his rockets came from. For the rest of his life, he'll claim he was just an engineer following orders, that he didn't choose to use slave labor, that his focus was on the rockets themselves. But he saw, he knew, and he kept working. By September 1944, the V-2 was ready. Production was ramping up, launch sites were prepared in occupied territories, and Hitler gave the order: begin the bombardment. September 8, 1944, the first operational V-2 attack. Target: Paris, recently liberated by the Allies. The rocket missed, landing in an empty suburb, killing 6 people. Hours later, another V-2 launched. Target: London. This one hit Staveley Road in Chiswick. 3 dead, 17 injured, and the terror campaign had begun. Over the next 7 months, more than 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched at Allied cities. London took the worst of it, over 500 strikes. Antwerp, the vital port supplying Allied forces, was hit over 1,600 times. Each rocket carried a 1-ton warhead. Each impact created devastation, and there was no defense, no way to shoot them down, no way to hear them coming. The first sound victims heard was the explosion itself. The psychological impact was enormous. With conventional bombs, with the V-1 flying bombs that came before, people had warning. They could hear the engines. They could run to shelters. But the V-2? One moment you're walking down the street, the next moment everything within 100 yards is obliterated. Survivors described a strange double boom, the sonic boom of the rocket breaking the sound barrier, followed immediately by the explosion. By the time you heard anything, it was already over. The British government tried to keep it quiet at first. Remember that gas main explosion story? They stuck with that for weeks, trying to keep panic from spreading. But you can't hide explosions that level entire apartment blocks. Word got out. People knew something new was falling from the sky. And when the government finally admitted it in November 1944, when they finally told the public about the rockets, the fear became official. There was nothing anyone could do. No air raid sirens could help. No shelters were deep enough if one landed directly on you. You just lived with it, went about your day knowing that death could fall from space at any moment.
And here's what made it even more terrifying. The targeting was terrible. The V-2's guidance system, sophisticated as it was for its time, couldn't pinpoint specific targets. The rockets aimed at cities, at large areas, and hoped to hit something important. Most landed in residential neighborhoods, civilians going about their lives. A rocket hit a Woolworths department store in London on a Saturday afternoon, killed 168 people, injured 120 more. Another hit a cinema, another hit a hospital. Random destruction raining from the edge of space. Military commanders on both sides knew the V-2 wasn't changing the outcome of the war. It wasn't strategic bombing that could cripple industry or infrastructure. It was pure terror, vengeance, just like the name said. Germany was being destroyed by Allied bombing, their cities reduced to rubble, and the V-2 was Hitler's way of striking back, of proving that Germany still had technological superiority, still had wonder weapons that could hurt the enemy. And so, the rockets kept launching.
But while London and Antwerp suffered, something else was happening. Allied intelligence was scrambling to understand this new weapon. How did it work? Where was it launched from? How could it be stopped? Spies, reconnaissance planes, resistance fighters in occupied Europe all fed information back to analysts in Britain. They pieced together reports of massive rockets being transported on special rail cars, of mobile launch platforms hidden in forests, of supply chains delivering liquid oxygen and alcohol fuel to launch sites. The Allies tried everything to stop the V-2 attacks. They bombed suspected launch sites, but the Germans used mobile launchers that could be set up, fire a rocket, and drive away before any retaliation could arrive. They bombed the production facilities, but Mittelbau-Dora was deep underground, nearly impossible to hit. They bombed supply routes, rail yards, fuel depots. None of it stopped the rockets. The attacks continued right up into the last weeks of the war, until Allied ground forces finally overran the launch areas and there was nowhere left to fire from. March 27, 1945. The last V-2 struck Britain. By then, Germany was collapsing. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east. American and British forces were crossing the Rhine from the west. The war was ending. And suddenly, everyone wanted the V-2 technology. See, military planners on both sides understood what they were looking at. This wasn't just a weapon. This was the future of warfare. Whoever controlled rocket technology would control the next generation of military power. Missiles that could fly across continents, that could carry bombs or chemicals, or, well, rumors were already circulating about atomic weapons. Imagine a rocket like the V-2, but bigger, with longer range, capable of crossing oceans, capable of carrying the kind of bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. That would change everything. So began one of the strangest races in history. Operation Paperclip, the Americans called their effort. The goal was simple: capture as much V-2 technology as possible, capture the scientists who built it, and bring it all back to America before the Soviets could get their hands on it. Because the Soviets wanted the same thing. Both sides knew that Peenemünde and Mittelbau-Dora held the secrets to the next era of military technology. American forces reached Mittelbau-Dora first in April 1945. What they found horrified them. Thousands of bodies, survivors barely alive, the evidence of mass death everywhere. They freed the remaining prisoners, they documented the atrocities, and then they started looking for rockets. The Germans, knowing the end was near, had hidden components, blueprints, technical documents. Some were buried, some were hidden in nearby tunnels. Some had been evacuated south to Bavaria. American intelligence teams fanned out, searching, interrogating captured German personnel, following every lead. And they were looking for one man in particular, Wernher von Braun, the brilliant mind behind the V-2. The engineer who could unlock all the secrets of rocket technology, because whoever got von Braun would have a massive advantage in the coming missile race. Von Braun wasn't stupid. He knew what was coming. As Germany collapsed, he gathered his core team of engineers and scientists, about 500 people, and moved south into Bavarian Alps. He'd already decided. He was surrendering to the Americans. Not the Soviets, who he feared would either kill him or force him to work in some gulag, and not the British or French, who might try him for war crimes.
The Americans seemed like his best option. They had resources, they had ambition, and they wanted to beat the Soviets. Von Braun believed he could trade his knowledge for safety, for a chance to keep working on rockets, even if it meant working for a former enemy. May 2nd, 1945. Von Braun's younger brother, Magnus, bicycled down a mountain road in Austria and approached an American private from the 44th Infantry Division. In broken English, he said something like, "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V-2. We want to surrender." The private probably had no idea what that meant, but the message got passed up the chain of command, fast. Within hours, American intelligence officers were interrogating Wernher von Braun. Within days, the decision was made. The United States wanted him and his entire team. Meanwhile, the Soviets arrived at what was left of Mittelbau-Dora and found it picked clean. The Americans had already taken tons of equipment, documents, rocket components. They'd even disassembled and shipped back to the United States about 100 complete V-2 rockets, enough to study, test, and re-engineer. The Soviets were furious, but they started their own salvage operation, taking everything the Americans had left behind, capturing their own group of German rocket engineers, and beginning their own missile program. The Cold War was starting, and it started with both superpowers racing to master the technology that Nazi Germany had created, a technology built by slave labor, designed to terrorize cities, now being repurposed for even more destructive purposes. Von Braun and his team arrived in the United States in late 1945. They were initially held at Fort Bliss in Texas, technically as prisoners of war, though they were treated more like valued consultants. The U.S. Army wanted to learn everything they knew. They wanted to understand not just how the V-2 worked, but how to improve it, how to make it go farther, carry more payload, hit targets with greater accuracy. Von Braun was only too happy to teach them. For him, this was a second chance, a chance to keep working on rockets, to pursue his dreams of space exploration, even if it meant working for a former enemy. The Americans started testing captured V-2 rockets at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. One by one, they launched them, each one providing data, revealing secrets, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Some exploded, some veered off course, but some flew beautifully, arcing into the thin upper atmosphere just like they had over Europe, except now carrying scientific instruments instead of warheads. Cameras photographing the curvature of the Earth, instruments measuring cosmic radiation. The V-2 was becoming a tool of science. And here's where the story gets really strange. On October 24th, 1946, at White Sands, engineers attached the camera to a V-2 and launched it. The rocket climbed, reached an altitude of 65 miles, and the camera took photographs. When they recovered the film, when they developed it, they had the first photographs of Earth from space. Black and white images showing the curve of the planet, clouds, the darkness beyond the atmosphere. Humanity's first glimpse of our world from above. The weapon that had killed thousands was now showing us wonders we'd never seen before. Von Braun watched these tests with growing excitement. To him, this was vindication. This was proof that his vision of space travel wasn't fantasy. If a rocket could reach 65 miles, then a better rocket could reach 100 miles, 200, eventually orbit. He started writing papers, giving lectures, explaining to anyone who would listen that rockets could take humans to the moon, to Mars, to the planets. Most people thought he was crazy. Some people thought he was dangerous. But a few people, a few visionaries in the military and in science, started to believe. The Soviets were doing the same thing. Their captured German engineers were helping them build their own rockets, their own missile program. Stalin wanted weapons that could threaten America, that could deliver atomic bombs across the world if necessary. The USSR's chief rocket designer, Sergei Korolev, studied everything the Germans had done and began designing rockets that would surpass the V-2. By the early 1950s, both superpowers had missile programs far more advanced than anything Germany had achieved during the war. But the V-2's influence went beyond just military technology. See, that rocket had proven something fundamental. It proved that space was accessible. It proved that with enough engineering skill, enough resources, enough determination, Humans could build machines that escaped the atmosphere. Before the V-2, space travel was science fiction, fantasy, the stuff of pulp novels and wild speculation. After the V-2, it was just a matter of time and effort. In 1950, von Braun and his team were moved to Huntsville, Alabama, where they became the core of the U.S. Army's rocket development program. They were given American citizenship, cleansed of their Nazi past through paperwork and political convenience, and set to work building bigger, better missiles. The Redstone rocket, the Jupiter missile, each one more powerful than the last, each one based on lessons learned from the V-2. October 4th, 1957. The world changed again. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, a metal sphere the size of a beach ball, beeping radio signals as it orbited the Earth every 90 minutes. The space age had begun. And the rocket that launched Sputnik, the R-7 Semyorka, was a direct descendant of the V-2. Its engines, its fuel system, its basic design philosophy, all traced back to what von Braun and his team had created at Peenemünde. The Americans were shocked, embarrassed, terrified. The Soviets had beaten them to space. If the USSR could put a nuclear warhead in orbit, they could put any city in America with no warning, just like London had been hit by V-2s 13 years earlier. The shock of Sputnik sparked a space race that would consume billions of dollars and dominate the next decade. And the man Americans turned to, the man they asked to catch up to the Soviets, was Wernher Braun. Von Braun became famous. He appeared on television. He consulted with Walt Disney on a series of educational films about space travel. He gave speeches about the future, about lunar bases and expeditions to Mars. The American public loved him. They saw him as a visionary, a scientist who would lead America into the space age. Most of them had no idea about his past, about the slave labor that built his rockets, about the thousands who died at Mittelbau-Dora. That history was classified, buried, deemed irrelevant to the Cold War struggle. January 31st, 1958. Von Braun's team launched Explorer-1, America's first satellite into orbit. The rocket that carried it, the Jupiter C, was essentially an advanced V-2, evolved and improved, but built on the same fundamental principles. Von Braun was redeemed. He was a hero, and he was just getting started. When President Kennedy announced in 1961 that America would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, when he committed the nation to the most ambitious technological achievement in human history, the man who made it possible was Wernher Braun. He became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. He designed the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful rocket ever built, the rocket that would carry Apollo astronauts to the moon. And the Saturn V, for all its size and complexity, for all the innovations it contained, its basic design, its core principles, came from the V-2. July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. The Saturn V had worked perfectly. Von Braun's dream, the dream he'd held since he was a young man in 1920s Germany, had come true. Humanity had reached another world. And we did it with technology that began as a weapon of terror, built by slave labor, designed to kill civilians. We did it with the legacy of the V-2. That's the impossible, uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. The technology that opened space to us, that let us explore the solar system, that gave us satellites for communication and GPS and weather monitoring and 1,000 other benefits. That technology has blood on it. It was forged in evil. It was built on suffering. And we can't erase that, no matter how many amazing things we've done with rockets since. Von Braun died in 1977. By then, he'd become one of the most famous scientists in the world. He'd been on the cover of magazines. He'd met presidents and celebrities. He'd seen his rockets carry humans to the moon and robotic probes to the planets. But he never fully acknowledged his role in the horrors of Mittelbau-Dora. He never expressed real remorse for the slave labor that made his early rockets possible. He maintained until his death that he was just an engineer following his passion, that the decisions about how to build the rockets weren't his to make, that he was focused on the technology, not the politics or the human cost. History has struggled with how to judge him. Was he a visionary who advanced human civilization? Yes. Was he complicit in war crimes? Also yes. Can both things be true at the same time? That's the question we're still grappling with. Today, every rocket that launches from Earth carries the DNA of the V-2. The SpaceX Falcon rockets that carry astronauts to the space station, the rockets that launch military satellites, the rockets that send probes to study Mars and Jupiter and the outer solar system. They all use liquid fuel engines, gyroscopic guidance systems, stage designs, technologies that were pioneered by von Braun's team between 1937 and 1945. We've improved everything, made it all vastly more reliable and powerful and safe. But the fundamental breakthroughs happened at Peenemünde and were proven over the skies of London. The V-2 rocket launched more than just a technological revolution. It launched a moral question that we still haven't fully answered. What do we do with knowledge gained through evil? Do we reject it, refuse to use anything tainted by its origins, or do we take it, use it for good, and try to honor the victims by achieving something beautiful with technology born in darkness? There's no easy answer. Both positions have merit. Both positions have been argued by historians and ethicists for decades. What we can say for certain is this: the V-2 rocket changed everything. It changed warfare, making long-range missiles a reality and starting an arms race that defined the Cold War. It changed technology, proving that humans could build machines capable of leaving the atmosphere. It changed our understanding of what was possible, showing that space travel wasn't fantasy but achievable engineering. And it changed history, becoming the foundation for programs that would take us to the moon and beyond. September 20th, 1944. That date we started with. The first V-2 to hit England. 3 people died that day. 3 people whose names were Mrs. Ada Harrison, 3-year-old Rosemary Clark, and sapper Bernard Browning. They died because a rocket launched from the Netherlands climbed to the edge of space and fell back to Earth at supersonic speed. They died because of technology that would eventually take humanity to other worlds. They died in a war that killed millions, in a campaign of terror that achieved nothing strategic, nothing that helped Germany avoid defeat. Their deaths and the deaths of everyone killed by V-2 attacks and the deaths of the 20,000 prisoners who built the rockets, they all matter. They're part of this story too. Not just the engineering triumph, not just the space-age legacy, but the human cost. Because that's what makes the V-2 story so complicated, so uncomfortable, so important to understand. We reached the edge of space for the first time, and we did it to make a weapon. We achieved one of humanity's greatest dreams, and we built it on a foundation of nightmares. The V-2 rocket stands as both our greatest triumph and our deepest shame. It represents the pinnacle of human ingenuity and the depths of human cruelty. It's a reminder that technology is neutral, that the same innovation that can take us to the stars can also rain death from them. And it's a warning, one we should never forget, that the tools we create can be used for purposes we never intended, that the dreams we chase can be corrupted, and that the price of progress is sometimes paid in blood by people who never chose to be part of the equation. Every time a rocket launches today, every time we send satellites into orbit or astronauts to the space station, every time we marvel at images sent back from Mars rovers or deep space telescopes, we're benefiting from the legacy of the V-2. We're using technology refined from a weapon of terror, technology that killed thousands, technology built by slave labor in underground caves. We can't change that history. We can't go back and make it clean. All we can do is remember. Remember where it came from. Remember what it cost. Remember that progress doesn't erase the past. It just builds on it, layer upon layer, until sometimes we forget what's underneath. The V-2 rocket reached the edge of space. It touched the darkness beyond our atmosphere, and in doing so, it showed humanity both our potential and our peril. We can reach the stars. We can achieve the impossible, but the path to those achievements isn't always noble, isn't always clean, isn't always something we should be proud of. Sometimes we reach our greatest heights by standing on the shoulders of victims. Sometimes our triumphs are inseparable from our tragedies. That's the truth. That's what the V-2 really represents. Not just a rocket, but a mirror showing us who we really are, what we're capable of, for better and for worse. And that September morning in 1944, when the first V-2 struck and people died without warning, without any chance to take shelter or say goodbye, that was the moment we learned that space wasn't just the final frontier. It was also the ultimate high ground, the place where weapons could strike without warning, where technology could kill at the speed of sound, where the future of warfare and the dream of exploration became impossible to separate. We're still living with that reality today, still trying to figure out how to pursue the dream without creating new nightmares. The V-2 rocket reached the edge of space 79 years ago, and we're still trying to understand what that means, what we learned from it, what it cost us, and where it's taking us next. The story isn't over. It's still being written. Every launch, every mission, every rocket that climbs toward the stars is another chapter. And maybe, just maybe, if we remember where we came from, if we honor the victims who paid the price for our progress, we can make sure that the next chapters are better than the first ones, that the technology born in terror can be used for peace, that the rockets that killed can save lives instead, that the dream of space, the dream that drove von Braun and his team even as they built weapons, can finally be separated from the nightmares that made it possible. That's what we owe the people who died. That's what we owe history, to remember, to learn, and to do better. If this story affected you, hit that subscribe button. We're uncovering forgotten history every week. Stories about the technology that changed our world, about the people who built it, about the price we paid for progress. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. This is history that matters, history that shaped everything we have today, and you're part of keeping these stories alive.